Billionaire sees a homeless black teen carrying his sick mother. What he does changes everything. The boy who carried her, he didn't put her down. Not once. Not for 6 blocks, not when his legs shook, not when a security guard put a hand flat on his chest and told him to stop right there. That's where this story starts. Not at the beginning. At the moment, everything cracked open. A boy, 17 years old, soaked through his shirt, an old woman's arms locked around his neck, her white hair pressed against his cheek. A hospital 10 feet away. A crowd of strangers already reaching for their phones instead of their hands. "Sir, I need you to set her down and step back." "She can't breathe right," the boy said. "Please, she needs a doctor, not—" "Step back. Now hold that. Hold that moment right there, because you need to understand how they got to that sidewalk before you'll understand what happened next. And trust me, what happened next is the kind of thing you tell your grandchildren about. Let's go back 3 hours. Devonte Achebe woke up on a bench outside a laundromat on 79th Street with a stiff neck and a stomach that had given up complaining. It was July in Chicago, and the heat had that thick, wet quality that made the whole South Side feel like it was breathing through a towel. He sat up, wiped his face with the collar of his shirt, and checked the only thing he owned that mattered. A small, cracked leather Bible, no bigger than his palm, tucked in the inside pocket of his hoodie. Still there. Still safe. He opened it, out of habit more than faith some mornings, and a folded prayer card slid halfway out, soft at the edges from being touched too many times. He didn't read it. He never needed to read it. He just needed to feel it was still there, the way another boy might check for his phone or his house keys. This was Devonte's proof that he had once belonged to somebody. His mother, Adaeze, had died 8 months ago. Cancer, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already unpacked its bags and settled in. She'd raised him alone in a 2-bedroom apartment 2 blocks from where he now slept on benches, worked 2 jobs until her body simply refused to keep doing it, and never once let him see her cry, not until the very end, when there wasn't strength left to hide it anymore. After she passed, the apartment went with her. Devonte lasted 6 weeks with an aunt in Gary before the arguments about money got too loud and too personal, and he left before anyone could ask him to. Since then, it had been shelters when there was room, church basements when there wasn't, and benches when neither worked out. He'd been an honor roll student. Now he was a boy the city walked past, but he had one appointment he never missed. Tuesdays and Fridays, without fail, he walked 40 minutes to the Lakeshore Manor Care Home on the west side to see a woman named Eleanor Whitaker. Everybody just called her Miss Ellie. Devonte had met her 18 months earlier, back when his mother was still alive and doing dialysis 3 times a week at a clinic downtown. Miss Ellie worked the overnight cleaning shift at that same clinic, 81 years old and still mopping floors because her pension from her late husband's factory job hadn't kept pace with rent in 30 years. She and Adaeze had struck up a friendship in the strange, honest way people do at 4 in the morning when neither one has the energy left to pretend. "Your mama," Ellie used to tell him, gripping his hand with fingers that trembled slightly from age. "She talked about you like you already won something, like you were already somebody." When Adaeze died, exactly 2 people showed up to the funeral who weren't required to be there by blood. One was the pastor. The other was a small, stooped white woman in a 30-year-old wool coat despite it being April, who cried harder than anyone in the church and pressed a folded $20 bill into Devonte's palm afterward. Money he later learned was nearly everything she had left that month. "You come see me," she'd told him. "You hear? Don't you disappear on me too." So he didn't. Every Tuesday and Friday, rain or shine, empty stomach or not, Devonte walked to Lakeshore Manor and sat with Miss Ellie in the day room, where the air conditioning rattled more than it cooled, and the staff moved through the halls like they were counting down a shift rather than caring for people. He noticed things nobody else seemed to notice, that her clothes hadn't been washed in longer than they should have been, that her prescriptions ran out and stayed out for days before anyone refilled them, that the woman 2 doors down from her had bruises she couldn't explain and a family that hadn't visited in over a year, that the facility's paint was peeling in the exact places administrators wouldn't walk. And he noticed the woman who ran the place, Denise Hollingsworth, always had a new watch, a new bag, a new reason why the budget's tight this month. Whenever a resident asked for something as simple as a fresh set of sheets, Devonte didn't have proof of anything. He had a GED he hadn't finished, and no one who'd believe a homeless black teenager over a woman with a framed director's license on her office wall. So he did the only thing he could do. He showed up, twice a week, like a promise he refused to break. He'd tried once to say something. 3 months back, He'd asked to speak to Denise Hollingsworth directly, standing in her office doorway with his hands folded in front of him the way his mother taught him to stand when he wanted to be taken seriously. "Ma'am, Miss Ellie's been asking for her heart medication for 4 days. She said the pharmacy delivery's been late." Denise hadn't even looked up from her desk. "We're handling it. She's scared, ma'am. She thinks nobody's listening to her." "And who exactly are you to her?" Denise had finally raised her eyes, taking in his second-hand shoes, the fray at his collar, the exhaustion that never quite left his face those days. "You're not on her visitor authorization list. I could have you removed just for being in this hallway." "I'm the only one who comes," Devante had said quietly, and left before his voice could do something he'd regret. He never told Ellie about that conversation. She had enough weight on her already. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Denise Hollingsworth had been quietly siphoning small amounts from the personal accounts of residents who had no family checking in, residents like Ellie, whose only listed next of kin hadn't returned a phone call from the facility in over a year. A few dollars here for administrative fees that weren't real. A missed refill there, replaced with a cheaper generic, and the difference pocketed. Small enough that no single theft would ever trigger an audit. Large enough over years, across dozens of forgotten residents, to fund a lifestyle far beyond what a mid-tier care home director's salary should have allowed. Devante didn't have the words for what he was watching. He only had the feeling in his gut every time he left that building, the feeling that something was wrong in a way that adults with authority kept insisting wasn't his business. That Tuesday, the one that changed everything, he arrived to find Miss Ellie sitting up in her wheelchair in the hallway outside her room, alone, her lips faintly blue at the edges, her breathing shallow and fast. "Miss Ellie?" She turned her head slowly. Her eyes found him, but it took her a moment longer than it should have to focus. "Devante, baby," she rasped. "My chest, it's doing that thing again." He looked down the hall, empty. He looked toward the nurse's station. A single aide sat behind the desk, scrolling on her phone, headphones in. "I need help," Devante called out. "Something's wrong with her." The aide glanced up, pulled one earbud out. "She does this," she said flatly. "Anxiety. She'll settle." "She's not settling. Look at her lips. I'm not authorized to—" "Then get someone who is." The aide sighed like he'd interrupted her lunch, picked up a phone, and made a call that lasted 11 seconds before she hung up and said, "Nurse'll be by when she can." Devante crouched in front of Ellie's wheelchair. Her hand found his and squeezed, weak but insistent, the way she always squeezed when she wanted him to know she was still in there, still fighting. "Devante," she whispered, "don't let them just—" "Leave me in a hallway." Something in her voice broke something in him. He'd heard that same fear in his mother's voice, near the end, in hospital hallways that felt too long and too indifferent. Not again. Not to her, too. "I'm not leaving you," he said. "I'm taking you myself." The nearest hospital was 6 blocks away. Cedar Grove Medical downtown, in the shadow of glass towers that had nothing to do with the neighborhood Devante called home. He tried the front desk phone at Lakeshore first, dialing 911 himself when no staff would, but the dispatcher told him the average wait for a non-priority call in that district was 45 minutes to an hour. Ellie didn't have an hour. He could see that in the gray creeping into her face. There was no van. No one would authorize an ambulance transfer without paperwork that would take longer than the walk itself. There was no money in Devante's pocket for a cab, and even if there had been, no cab was stopping for a sweat-soaked black teenager flagging one down on that stretch of road. So he made a decision that would end up on the evening news by nightfall, though he had no way of knowing that yet. He knelt down in front of her wheelchair, hooked his arms beneath hers, and said, "Hold on to me, Miss Ellie. Just hold on." She weighed less than she should have, the body of someone the world had quietly stopped feeding properly. But 6 blocks in July heat, with a full-grown woman on his back, is 6 blocks in July heat, with a full-grown woman on his back, no matter how light she'd gotten. Devante's shirt was soaked through by the 2nd block, his legs burned by the 4th. Ellie's arms tightened weakly around his neck, her breath rasping warm against his ear. "You're gonna make it, Miss Ellie," he said, more to himself than to her. "You hear me? You're gonna make it." "I know, baby," she whispered. "I know 'cause you're the one carrying me." People stared. Of course they stared. A boy in a stained hoodie carrying an elderly white woman on his back through downtown Chicago is not a sight this city's imagination is prepared for. Some looked away. Some pulled out their phones. Not to call for help, but to record. One man crossed the street entirely, rather than get close enough to ask if they needed anything. Nobody offered a car. Nobody offered a hand. A woman near a bus stop did lower her phone, and for a moment Devante thought she might come toward him. Instead, she said loud enough to carry, "Somebody should call somebody about that," as though he were a stray dog dragging something it shouldn't, and not a boy carrying the closest thing he had left to family. "Ma'am," Devante managed, not stopping, "can you call the hospital? Tell them we're coming." The woman blinked, unsure whether he was actually speaking to her, then raised her phone again, not to dial, but to film him asking. He stopped expecting help after that. He simply walked, one foot, then the other, counting silently the way he used to count free throws in gym class, back when he still had a school to go to, back when his biggest worry was whether he'd make varsity. Ellie's breathing rattled faintly against his ear with every other step, and each time it caught, he found some new reserve of strength he didn't know his body still had. "Tell me about him," Ellie mumbled once, somewhere around the third block, her voice thin as paper. "Your daddy, your mama never said much." Devante swallowed hard, kept walking. "Nigerian. Came here for school. Died before I was born. Car accident. Mama never talked about his family. Said there was bad blood over money, over inheritance, something like that. Said she didn't want none of it." "Sounds like your mama," Ellie whispered, almost smiling despite everything. "Too proud to take what wasn't given with love." Devante didn't answer. He didn't have breath to spare for an answer. He just held on tighter and kept walking. By the fifth block, Devante's vision had started to blur at the edges, his shoulders screaming, his mother's Bible bouncing loose against his hip with every labored step. He didn't stop. He'd made a promise, and promises were the only inheritance he had left. They reached the hospital's front entrance just as a black SUV pulled up to the curb beside them. The automatic doors of Cedar Grove slid open, and Devante stumbled inside. Ellie's weight nearly buckling his knees now that the finish line was in sight, and his body had permission to feel exactly how tired it was. "Please," he gasped at the front desk. "She needs help. Her heart, she can't breathe right." The receptionist, a woman in her 40s with a lanyard that read, "Patient Services," looked up from her monitor and took in the scene before her with an expression Devante had learned to recognize the way you learn to recognize weather before a storm. A disheveled teenage boy. A frail, elderly white woman slumped against his back, unconscious now, her head lolling to one side. No ID visible, no insurance card in hand, no relationship the desk could immediately place. "Sir, is this woman related to you? She needs a doctor. Now. Please, just..." "Sir, I need to know who this woman is and what your relationship to her is before..." "Does that matter right now? Look at her." The receptionist's hand moved beneath the desk. Devante heard the soft click of a button being pressed, the kind that summons security without announcing that it has. "I'm going to need you to step back from her," the receptionist said, her voice climbing half an octave, loud enough now that the waiting room had gone quiet, every eye turning toward them. "We have protocols. I can't just let an unaccompanied minor bring in a patient with no... I'm not trying to hurt her. She's basically my grandmother. I'm trying to save her life." Two security guards appeared from a side hallway, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who had already decided how this would go before they'd asked a single question. "Sir, set her down," the first guard said. "Now. She can't stand on her own. If I set her down, she'll..." Set her down. Devante's legs were shaking from exhaustion and something closer to grief. He lowered himself carefully, gently, so Ellie wouldn't hit the floor hard, cradling the back of her head as her body slid from his back into a heap against his knees, half-conscious, murmuring something that might have been his name. "On the ground?" Devante's voice cracked. "You want me to put her on the ground? We need to verify..." "She's dying, and you need to verify?" A small crowd had gathered by now, patients waiting for their own appointments, family members pulling out phones, a janitor pausing mid-mop near the doorway. Nobody moved to help, nobody moved to stop it either. They simply watched, the way people watch a car accident from behind glass, safe in the knowledge that whatever was happening wasn't happening to them. The first guard reached for Devante's arm. "You need to step outside, son." That word, son, landed like an insult dressed up as kindness. "I'm not leaving her." "Then we'll call the police and let them sort out who this woman belongs to." Behind Devante, at the sliding glass doors, a black SUV had come to a stop at the curb. A driver in a dark suit stepped out first, moving toward the trunk. A second man, older, tall, silver at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than every piece of clothing Devante had ever owned combined, was climbing out of the back seat, his attention snagged not by the shouting, not by the security guards, but by something small and dark that had tumbled from Devante's hoodie pocket during the chaos, and now lay open on the hospital floor. A tiny, cracked leather Bible. A folded prayer card had slipped halfway out of its pages, catching the fluorescent light. The man in the suit, Graham Ashford Bellow, though nobody in that lobby knew his name yet, only that his arrival had made the security guards suddenly straighten their posture, stopped walking entirely. He stared at that little Bible on the floor, the way a man stares at a ghost, because he recognized it. He had held that exact Bible in his own hands 30 years ago in a different country, on the day his sister packed one suitcase and walked out of their family's life forever. "Wait," Graham said, his voice cutting clean through the noise of the lobby, through the guards, through the receptionist's protocols, through 30 years of silence. "Everybody, wait." He crouched down, slowly, deliberately, and picked up the small leather Bible from the floor as if it might dissolve in his hands. He opened it to the inside cover, and there, in handwriting he hadn't seen in 3 decades but would have known anywhere in the world, were 4 words that stopped his heart cold. "To my Adai's love mama." Graham Ashford Bellow looked up, past the security guards, past the frightened receptionist, past the crowd with their phones still raised, directly at the exhausted, soaked-through teenage boy kneeling on the floor beside an unconscious old woman. "Who?" Graham asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Gave you this Bible?" Devante, still holding Ellie's hand, still furious, still terrified, blinked up at the stranger like the question made no sense, in a room where a woman was dying. "My mother," he said. "Why does that matter right now?" "She needs a doctor." Graham straightened up fast, turned toward the guards with an authority that made both of them take an involuntary step backward, and said 4 words that changed the temperature of the entire room. "Get her a doctor, now." The name on the card. Within 4 minutes of Graham Ashford Bellow saying, "Get her a doctor now," Cedar Grove Medical's emergency bay looked like a different hospital entirely. 2 physicians appeared where none had been available moments earlier. A gurney materialized. Ellie was lifted, stabilized, wheeled through double doors that had been closed to her and Devante a heartbeat before. The same receptionist who demanded proof of relationship now stammered apologies nobody had asked her for. Devante sat frozen on a waiting room bench, his shirt still damp, his hands still shaking, staring at the stranger in the expensive suit who was staring right back at him like he'd seen a resurrection. "Sit," Graham said gently, lowering himself onto the bench beside the boy. "Please. You've done more than enough carrying for one day. Who are you?" "My name is Graham Ashford Bellow." He said it the way a man says a name he expects to matter, then seemed to catch himself, softening. "I own Ashford Health Partners. This hospital and about 40 others across the country, in fact. I was here for a ribbon cutting on the new pediatric wing next door when I saw you come through those doors." Devante's exhaustion made his patience thin. "Okay, and?" Graham held up the small leather Bible, still open to its inside cover, his thumb resting just beneath the faded ink. "This belonged to my mother. She gave it to my sister on her 16th birthday back in Lagos, before we ever came to this country. I would know this handwriting anywhere in the world." He turned the Bible so Devante could see the inscription clearly. "To my Adai's love mama." "That's my mother's name," Devante said slowly, something cold moving through his chest that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "Adai's. She died 8 months ago." Graham closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, they were wet. "My sister's name was Adai's Ashford," he said. "She left our family 31 years ago, after a terrible fight over our father's estate. She married an American man against our parents' wishes, cut off every phone number, every letter. My mother spent the last 15 years of her life asking me, every single time we spoke, whether I'd found her yet." He paused, his voice catching. "I never did. I hired investigators. I chased dead leads across 3 states. And then I stopped believing I ever would." Devante's mouth had gone dry. "My mama's maiden name wasn't Ashford. It was Achebe." "A name she likely chose herself," Graham said quietly. "To disappear more completely. To make sure no one from our family could ever trace her." He looked at Devante with an expression the boy couldn't quite name. Grief and hope tangled together so tightly they'd become the same feeling. "What was your father's name, son?" Emeka Achebe. He died in a car accident before I was born. Graham nodded slowly, as though confirming something he'd already suspected the moment he saw that Bible hit the floor. If your mother was who I believe she was, he said, then you are my nephew, my sister's only child. The waiting room noise seemed to fall away. Devante stared at this stranger, silver-templed, imperious, weeping quietly in a $2,000 suit, and felt something crack open in his chest that he'd kept sealed shut since the funeral. I don't have family, Devante said, and his voice broke on the word family like it was a stone too heavy to carry. I don't have anybody. You have me, Graham said. If you'll let me prove it. By 6 o'clock that evening, the footage was everywhere. Someone in that hospital lobby, one of the many phones raised instead of hands, had captured nearly the entire confrontation. Devante pleading for help, the receptionist demanding identification from an unconscious woman, the security guards ordering a collapsing elderly patient onto the floor, and Graham Ashford Bellow's voice cutting through it all like a judge's gavel. The clip hit social media under a caption that read simply, Chicago hospital security tried to remove a black teen for carrying a white woman on his back. Then a billionaire showed up and everything changed. By midnight, it had 11 million views. By morning, local news vans were parked outside Cedar Grove Medical, and the hospital's PR department had gone dark, refusing all comment while lawyers reviewed the footage frame by frame. Devante, sitting in a hotel room Graham had arranged for him, the first bed with clean sheets he'd slept in for 8 months, watched the video with a strange, hollow feeling. He hadn't wanted to be famous. He'd wanted Miss Ellie to be okay. His phone, an old cracked model that barely held a charge, buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. This is Devante. Mr. Achebe, this is Trisha Boone with Channel 9 News. We'd love to get your side of the story. He hung up. It buzzed again 10 seconds later. A different number. He turned it off entirely and looked at Graham, who was standing near the window, phone pressed to his own ear, speaking low and fast to someone about media strategy and legal exposure and protecting the boy from becoming a headline instead of a person. You don't have to do all this, Devante said when Graham finally hung up. I do, actually. Graham sat across from him, his expensive suit slightly rumpled now, hours into a day that had upended both their lives. Because in a few hours, this story is going to stop being about you saving Eleanor Whitaker's life, and it's going to start being about whatever the hospital's lawyers decide to make it about. I've seen this happen before. They will look for a way to make you the problem. He wasn't wrong. By 9 the next morning, Cedar Grove Medical had issued a statement calling the incident an unfortunate miscommunication and insisting all staff had followed appropriate protocol given the circumstances of an unaccompanied minor arriving without documentation. The statement made no mention of the guards ordering a dying woman onto the floor. It made no mention of the 45-minute ambulance wait that had forced Devante to carry her 6 blocks in the first place. It did, however, mention, almost as an aside, that Eleanor Whitaker's legal next of kin, her son Nathan Whitaker Jr., had been immediately notified and was cooperating fully with hospital administration. Devante read that line 4 times. While the hospital's lawyers were drafting careful sentences, something else was happening that no press release could control. The video had reached Mount Zion Missionary Baptist, the small church on 79th Street, where Adaeze Achebe had worshipped every Sunday of Devante's childhood, and where Devante hadn't set foot since the funeral because grief had made the pews feel unbearable. Pastor Curtis Odom, a broad, soft-spoken man who'd baptized Devante at age 9, saw the clip on his daughter's phone at 6 in the morning and was on the phone with 3 deacons before 7. That's Sister Adaize's boy, he told them, his voice thick. That's Devante carrying that woman. Lord, that's our Devante. By that evening, Mount Zion's small congregation had organized what Pastor Odom called a prayer and provision drive. Folding tables set up in the church parking lot, church mothers arranging donated clothes and toiletries into neat piles, deacons collecting cash in a coffee can that filled up faster than anyone expected once word spread through the neighborhood. It wasn't much by the standards of the glass towers downtown, but it was everything by the standards of a community that had watched one of its own children sleep on benches for 8 months, without anyone in power lifting a finger, until a camera happened to be pointed the right direction. We failed that boy, Pastor Odom said from the pulpit that Wednesday night, his voice cracking. 8 months he's been out here, and how many of us knew? How many of us looked away because it was easier than looking at him? Devante didn't hear the sermon live. Graham played him a recording of it 2 days later, in the quiet of the hotel room, and Devante sat with his head in his hands and cried for the first time since his mother's funeral. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to being seen. "They didn't forget me," he said quietly. "I thought everybody forgot me." "No one who matters ever did," Graham said. The news cycle, meanwhile, moved the way news cycles do, fast, hungry, and indifferent to nuance. Two competing narratives began to calcify online within 48 hours. One painted Devante as exactly what he was, a homeless teenager who'd carried a dying woman 6 blocks because no one else would help her. The other, quietly seeded by a public relations firm Cedar Grove Medical had retained within hours of the footage going viral, suggested something murkier, that an unaccompanied minor with no documented relationship to an elderly woman with cognitive decline raised legitimate safety questions that deserved investigation before anyone rushed to canonize him. It was a narrative built entirely on the discomfort of a black teenager touching a white woman's body, dressed up in the language of protocol and liability. Devante recognized it instantly, the way you recognize a slur wearing a suit. "They're trying to make it about me being dangerous," he told Graham, staring at his phone despite having sworn off reading the comments, instead of about them almost letting her die on a lobby floor. "That's precisely why we need something they cannot spin," Graham said. "Not a video, not a headline. Something with her signature on it, in her own hand, that says exactly who you are to her and who has the right to speak for her. That kind of thing exists more often than people realize. It's just buried in a filing cabinet or a hollowed-out family Bible somewhere, waiting for someone to care enough to look." The hospital's statement also mentioned, almost as an aside, that Eleanor Whitaker's legal next of kin, her son Nathan Whitaker Jr., had been immediately notified and was cooperating fully with hospital administration. Devante read that line 4 times. "Her son," he said aloud. "She has a son." Graham, reading over his shoulder, frowned. "You didn't know that?" "She never talked about him. Not once. Not in 18 months. Devante's jaw tightened. "She talked about her husband. She talked about the factory where he worked. She never said a word about a son." They found out why by noon. Nathan Whitaker Jr. arrived at Cedar Grove Medical in a rented gray suit that fit a size too small, flanked by a lawyer he'd clearly hired within the last 12 hours, moving through the hospital corridors with the practiced urgency of a man performing concern for cameras rather than feeling it. He gave a brief statement to the assembled press outside the hospital doors, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion. "My mother has struggled with her health for some time," he said. "As her only family, I've done everything within my means to ensure she receives proper care. I'm deeply troubled that a minor with no legal authority took it upon himself to remove her from a licensed care facility without my knowledge or consent." It was, Devante would later learn, the first time Nathan Whitaker had visited his mother in 14 months. "He's lying," Devante said, watching the clip on Graham's tablet, his hands curling into fists. "She told me herself he stopped visiting. She told me the facility calls him and he doesn't pick up." "I believe you," Graham said. "But belief isn't evidence. And right now, the story is being written by people with lawyers and camera crews. We need something harder than your word against his." They found it 2 days later, in the last place either of them expected. Ellie had improved enough by then to sit up against her pillows and hold a full conversation, though her voice still carried the thin, papery quality of a woman who'd nearly lost her grip on the world entirely. Devante visited her every afternoon, and on the second day, he brought Graham with him, nervous in a way he rarely let himself be, watching to see how a woman who'd raised a son who abandoned her would react to a stranger claiming family ties to the boy she'd unofficially adopted. Ellie studied Graham for a long moment when Devante introduced him, her sharp eyes, still sharp, despite everything, moving over his face the way she used to study crossword clues. "You've got her chin," she said finally. "A daisy's. Same stubborn set to it." Graham's composure, carefully held together through 2 days of legal calls and press statements, finally slipped. "You knew her well?" "Knew her better than most people ever let themselves be known," Ellie said. "She was proud, your sister. Too proud to ask anybody for help, even when she needed it bad. Guess that runs in the family." She glanced pointedly at Devante, who looked away, embarrassed to be caught out. "Miss Ellie," Graham said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's hard to say. Has Nathan been taking care of you?" The silence that followed answered the question before Ellie spoke a word. "My son," she said slowly, "hasn't set foot in that home in over a year. Last time he came, he asked me to sign something. Papers about the house, the one his daddy and I paid off before he passed. I didn't understand half of what it said, and something in my gut told me not to sign it, so I didn't. He got so angry with me, Graham. Angrier than I'd ever seen him. Said I was being difficult on purpose. Didn't come back after that. Do you know what happened to those papers? No, Ellie admitted. But I know I hid something else a long while back before my mind started slipping on me. I was scared of exactly this happening, being shuffled off somewhere and forgotten, so I wrote something down. Had it witnessed proper, notarized and everything at the bank. Put it somewhere safe. She frowned, searching her fading memory. Devante, baby, do you remember that old family Bible I kept on my nightstand? The big one, not this little one your mama gave you? Devante's breath caught. Yes, ma'am. Check inside it, Ellie said. There's more inside that book than scripture? Devante and Graham drove to Lakeshore Manor together the next morning to retrieve it. A small wooden box, Ellie had said, hidden inside the hollowed-out family Bible on her nightstand. The one thing Denise Hollingsworth's staff had never bothered to search because it looked like nothing more than a battered old book nobody would want to steal. Their arrival made the facility's staff visibly nervous the moment Graham's black SUV pulled into the lot, his name recognized instantly by anyone who followed healthcare industry news. Denise Hollingsworth met them at the front door with a smile stretched so tight it looked painful. Mr. Ashford Bellow, what an honor. We had no idea you had any connection to one of our residents. I'd like access to Eleanor Whitaker's room, Graham said without returning her smile. Now, please. The room had already been cleared. Bed stripped, closet emptied, a fresh nameplate slot on the door ready for its next occupant, as though Ellie had already been erased before she'd even had the chance to come back. Where are her things? Devante demanded. Denise's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second. Facility policy, when a resident is transferred to hospital care beyond a certain number of days, is to prepare the room for— She's not dead, Devante snapped. She's getting better. Where are her things? They found the boxes in a storage closet down the hall, unlabeled, shoved between mop buckets and broken wheelchairs. Inside one of them, wrapped in a threadbare cardigan, was the family Bible Ellie had described, its spine cracked, its pages hollowed into a secret compartment holding a small wooden box tied shut with faded ribbon. Devante opened it with trembling hands. Inside were letters, dozens of them spanning nearly 2 decades, addressed to Nathan Whitaker Jr. at various addresses across the Midwest, letters Ellie had written and, judging by the stack of them still sealed and stamped, returned to sender in several cases, letters that had never once been answered. And beneath the letters, a stack of bank statements showing regular withdrawals from Ellie's personal account, authorized under Denise Hollingsworth's signature, for administrative and care supplement fees that matched no service Ellie had ever received. And beneath that, the item that would change everything in Part 3, a folded legal document Ellie had drawn up herself 3 years earlier, before her memory had begun to fade. A document Nathan Whitaker Jr. didn't know existed. A document that would determine exactly who had the legal right to speak for Eleanor Whitaker when it mattered most. Graham read the document twice, his expression shifting from grief to something sharper, the look of a man who had just found the exact leverage he needed. Devante, he said quietly, I think we just found the reason Nathan Whitaker is so desperate to control this story. Behind them, in the doorway, Denise Hollingsworth's face had gone the color of old paper. Those documents are private facility records, she said, her voice thin. You have no right. We have every right, Graham said, holding up the folded document between 2 fingers, like evidence at a trial. This has her signature, her sound mind, and your name isn't on it anywhere, Ms. Hollingsworth, which I suspect is precisely the problem. For the first time since they'd arrived, Denise Hollingsworth said nothing at all. What Devante chose. The document Ellie had hidden inside her family Bible turned out to be exactly what Graham suspected, a durable power of attorney, notarized 3 years earlier at First Prairie Bank, naming not Nathan Whitaker Jr., but a backup contact Ellie had listed almost as an afterthought at the time, Pastor Curtis Odom of Mount Zion Missionary Baptist, the only person she'd written in her own careful hand, who I trust to speak for me should my mind or body fail before my son finds his way back to me. She'd never told Nathan it existed. She'd never needed to, until now. Alongside it sat 3 years of bank statements showing withdrawals authorized under Denise Hollingsworth's signature, totaling just over $11,000 in fees for services. Lakeshore Manor's own records showed were never rendered, physical therapy sessions that never happened, medication deliveries that were billed but never filled, a wellness consultation charged monthly to nearly every resident on the facility's lowest income bracket, Ellie among them. Graham didn't call a lawyer first. He called a journalist he trusted, a woman named Adaora Bassi who'd built a career investigating elder care fraud across the Midwest and had been trying to get inside Lakeshore Manor's books for 2 years without success. Within a week, Adaora's investigation had done what Devontae's viral video alone never could have. It turned public sympathy into public accountability. Illinois' Department of Public Health opened a formal inquiry into Lakeshore Manor. 3 former employees, emboldened by the coverage, came forward with their own accounts of neglect and financial irregularities stretching back nearly 5 years. Denise Hollingsworth was placed on administrative leave within 72 hours of the story breaking. And by the second week, state investigators had frozen accounts tied directly to her name. Nathan Whitaker Jr.'s carefully rehearsed concern for his mother collapsed just as fast once Adaora's reporting revealed the truth beneath his public statements, the returned letters, the 14 months of silence, and, most damning of all, a set of house transfer documents he'd attempted to have Ellie sign 18 months earlier, quietly discovered in his own lawyer's files during discovery, that would have transferred ownership of his late father's fully paid-off house directly into Nathan's name while Ellie still lived, under the guise of estate planning. He had been trying, in plain terms, to take the one thing his mother had left before she'd even died. The state scheduled a public hearing for the 3rd week of that month, part licensing review for Lakeshore Manor, part guardianship determination for Ellie's care, and though no one said it aloud, part public reckoning for everyone who'd stood by and watched an old woman get quietly erased. Devontae hadn't wanted to attend. He told Graham as much the night before, sitting on the balcony of the apartment Graham had rented for him near Mount Zion. Modest by Graham's standards, but more space and more safety than Devontae had known in nearly a year. "I don't need to see them get what's coming to them," Devontae said. "I already know what I saw. I already know what's true." "This isn't only for you," Graham said gently. "It's for every resident in that building who doesn't have someone willing to fight for them the way you fought for Ellie. Your presence there matters more than you understand." Devontae thought about the woman 2 doors down from Ellie's old room, the one with bruises she couldn't explain and a family that never visited. He thought about all the residents whose names he'd never learned, whose neglect had never gone viral, whose stories would never trend. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go." The hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Reporters, former Lakeshore Manor employees, families of current residents, church members from Mount Zion who'd carpooled downtown in a caravan organized by Pastor Odom himself. Ellie sat in the front row in a wheelchair, dressed in a cardigan Devontae had bought her with his own first paycheck from a part-time job Graham had helped him secure, her hand gripping his the entire time. Denise Hollingsworth sat at a table with her attorney, her earlier composure entirely gone, her face pale under the fluorescent lights as auditors read aloud the specific dollar amounts, the specific residents, the specific months in which money had vanished from accounts belonging to people too old, too frightened, or too forgotten to notice. Nathan Whitaker Jr. sat 2 rows behind her, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear each time a new document was introduced, his face cycling through shades of a man watching his careful public image dissolve in real time. Before Devontae's name was called, the hearing chair invited testimony from 3 other families, people Devontae had never met, whose stories he'd never heard, but whose pain sounded so familiar it made his stomach turn. A woman named Patrice Dubois testified through tears about her mother, Yvonne, a Haitian immigrant who'd worked as a seamstress for 40 years before a stroke left her needing full-time care. Yvonne had been the woman 2 doors down from Ellie, the one with bruises she couldn't explain. Patrice had noticed the marks 18 months ago and been told repeatedly that her mother bruised easily due to her medication. It wasn't until state investigators pulled internal incident reports that the truth came out. 2 aides had been rough-handling residents who couldn't easily communicate or fight back, and Denise Hollingsworth had buried 3 separate complaints rather than report them, fearing the liability exposure. "My mother built a life in this country with her 2 hands," Patrice said, her voice shaking with a fury she'd clearly been holding in for months. She deserved better than to be hurt by the very people paid to protect her. An elderly man named Otis Freeman, a retired Pullman porter's son who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, testified that his medication had been substituted with a cheaper generic without his consent or his doctor's authorization, resulting in a seizure that landed him in the ICU for 4 days, a seizure the facility's own records blamed on patient non-compliance, rather than the substitution Denise had personally authorized to pad the facility's margins. By the time Devante's name was called, the room had already absorbed enough grief and quiet fury to fill a much longer day. He rose from his seat beside Ellie's wheelchair and walked to the podium on legs that felt, once again, like they might not hold him. His hands shook as he stood, not from fear of the room, but from the weight of finally saying out loud everything he'd carried silently for 18 months. "My name is Devante Achebe," he began. "I'm 17 years old. For the last 8 months, I didn't have a house. I slept on benches in shelters wherever I could. But twice a week I walked to Lakeshore Manor because there was a woman there who treated me like I still mattered, even when most of the world had stopped looking at me twice." He looked at Ellie. She squeezed his hand tighter. "I watched staff ignore residents calling for help. I watched medication run out and stay out for days. I watched a woman I love almost die in a hallway because nobody who was paid to care for her actually did." His voice cracked, but he kept going. "I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because Miss Ellie isn't the only person this happened to, and she won't be the last unless somebody makes it stop." The room was silent except for the sound of a stenographer's keys. Then the state's lead investigator, a woman named Renata Suarez, asked the question that would determine the next chapter of everyone's lives in that room. "Mr. Achebe, given everything you've testified to, and given the guardianship documentation submitted showing Mrs. Whitaker's own choice of an alternate power of attorney, the state is prepared to grant significant discretion in recommending her ongoing care arrangement. Do you have a recommendation for this court?" Every eye in the room turned to Devante. Nathan Whitaker Jr. straightened in his chair, his lawyer leaning forward. This was the moment everyone understood, when Devante could take his revenge cleanly and completely, recommend Nathan be stripped of any remaining claim, painted publicly and permanently as the villain he had, in fact, been. Devante looked at Ellie. Then, slowly, he looked at Nathan. "I'm not a judge," Devante said finally. "I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know everything that happened between Miss Ellie and her son over the years, or what made him stop coming around. I know what I saw. I know it hurt her. But Miss Ellie's told me more than once that she still loves him. Even now, even after everything. And my mama used to say that carrying hate for somebody costs you more than it costs them." He paused, gathering himself. "So here's what I'd ask. Not for him to get everything back like nothing happened. He needs to answer for what he tried to do with that house, and for leaving his mother in a place that was stealing from her while he stayed away. But I'd ask that whatever happens next leaves room for him to actually show up, if he chooses to. Really show up. Not for the cameras. For her." He looked directly at Nathan now. "Because I know what it's like to lose your mother and realize too late everything you should have said. I wouldn't wish that regret on anybody, not even him." The room was utterly silent. Nathan Whitaker Jr., who had spent 2 weeks defending himself with lawyers and rehearsed statements, put his face in his hands and, for the first time since the story broke, cried in public. Not performed grief this time, but something that looked uncomfortably like shame, finally catching up to him. The state's ruling, issued 3 days later, stripped Lakeshore Manor of its operating license pending a full sale and change of ownership, with Denise Hollingsworth facing formal charges of elder financial exploitation and neglect that would ultimately end in a plea agreement, restitution, and the loss of her license to operate any care facility in the state of Illinois ever again. Nathan Whitaker Jr. was found to have no standing to override his mother's existing power of attorney and was ordered to return the house transfer attempt records as part of a formal restitution agreement, but was not, as many had expected, barred from his mother's life. Instead, the court granted him supervised visitation, contingent on Ellie's own continued consent, a arrangement that satisfied almost no one watching from the outside, and yet felt, to Devante, like the only honest outcome available. Not punishment dressed up as justice, not forgiveness handed out for free, just a door left open, the way his mother always used to leave the porch light on even for people who disappointed her. Ellie herself, discharged from Cedar Grove's cardiac unit with a prognosis far better than anyone had dared hope, moved not into another care facility, but into a small guest cottage on the edge of the property Graham had purchased near his hospital's Chicago headquarters, close enough for Devante to visit every day, far enough from Lakeshore Manor's shadow to finally breathe. Nathan visited twice in the first month. Awkward, halting visits, full of long silences and unfamiliar apologies. Ellie let him come. She didn't pretend 14 months of silence hadn't happened, but she let the door stay open, exactly the width Devante had asked for. On his second visit, Nathan found Devante on the porch, waiting for him with 2 glasses of sweet tea, before he'd even reached the front step. "You didn't have to ask for leniency for me," Nathan said, standing awkwardly at the bottom of the stairs, unable to meet Devante's eyes. "After everything, after what I tried to do." "I didn't do it for you," Devante said honestly, handing him a glass. "I did it for her. She still cries sometimes, thinking about the boy you used to be before all this, before whatever it was that made you scared to just be her son without needing something from her first." Nathan's jaw tightened, old defensiveness rising fast. Then just as quickly, it fell away, leaving something rawer underneath. "My father's business failed when I was 22, he said quietly. "We went from comfortable to nothing almost overnight. I watched my mother clean floors at a dialysis clinic at 70 years old because my father's pension wasn't enough, and I was too ashamed to help because helping meant admitting how bad things had gotten for me, too. It was easier to disappear than to face her and tell her I couldn't fix it." "She never needed you to fix anything," Devante said. "She needed you to show up." Nathan looked at him for a long moment. Really looked, the way people rarely do with each other anymore. "You're 17 years old," he said. "How do you already understand things it's taken me 3 times that long to even start seeing?" "My mama taught me," Devante said simply. "Some lessons you don't get to unlearn even when you want to." They sat together on the porch steps in silence after that, no more words needed, watching the last of the daylight fade over a yard that, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, felt something like peace. Before he left that evening, Nathan paused at the bottom of the steps and turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think my mother chose well when she chose you, even before either of you understood what that choice would mean." Devante didn't have a response ready for that. He simply nodded and watched Nathan's car pull away down the quiet street, taillights fading into the summer dusk. A small, uncertain beginning where, a month earlier, there had been only silence and blame. "You did something in that hearing room I couldn't have done," Graham told Devante one evening, the 2 of them sitting on the porch of the cottage while Ellie dozed inside, stronger every week. "I wanted to destroy that man for what he did to my sister's memory, for what he almost let happen to the woman who loved her. You had every right to want the same, but you chose something harder." "My mama used to say revenge is easy," Devante said, watching the sun drop low over the yard. "Grace is the hard part. Anybody can hurt somebody back. Take something else to leave a door open for a person who don't deserve it yet." Graham was quiet for a long moment. "There's something else we need to talk about," he said finally. "Something about your inheritance. About what your mother left behind when she disappeared from our family, and what's owed to you because of it." Devante set down his glass slowly. "I don't want money I didn't earn, Graham. That's not who my mama raised me to be." "I understand that instinct," Graham said. "It's the same instinct that made her walk away from our family's wealth 31 years ago rather than stay somewhere she felt unwelcome and unseen. But I need you to understand something, too. When our father passed 12 years ago, his estate was divided according to Nigerian inheritance law and the terms of his will. 3 shares, 1 for each of his children. Your mother's share was never claimed because none of us could find her. It's been held in trust ever since, growing, waiting. It isn't charity, Devante. It was always hers, which means now it's yours. That's not the same as me earning something." "No," Graham agreed. "It's better than that in a way. It's proof that she was never forgotten. Even during the 31 years she believed she had to disappear completely to protect herself, and eventually you. She spent her whole life making sure you never felt entitled to anything you didn't work for. I respect that more than I can say. But refusing what's rightfully yours out of pride isn't honoring her memory, Devante. It's repeating the same isolation that cost her 31 years with the only family she had left." Devante was quiet for a long time, staring out at the yard where fireflies had begun to blink to life in the deepening dusk. "She used to say pride and dignity ain't the same thing," he said finally, his voice thick. "Said pride keeps you from asking for help you need. Dignity is knowing your worth, even when you do ask." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed, though Graham pretended not to notice. "I think she'd want me to stop being so scared of taking what's actually mine." "I think so too," Graham said gently. "What happens now?" "Now," Graham said, "we make sure you finish school. We make sure Miss Ellie never spends another day without someone looking after her properly. And we figure out together what kind of man you want to become with everything you've been given. The hard way. And now, finally, the easier way, too. Devante turned to look at him, and for the first time since that day in the hospital lobby, felt something other than exhaustion or grief settle over him. He felt cautiously like his life was finally about to become something he chose, rather than something that simply happened to him. The same corner, 1 year later, on a warm morning in July, a young man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out of a black car in front of Cedar Grove Medical and stood still for a moment on the exact stretch of sidewalk where, 12 months earlier, he had collapsed to his knees with an unconscious woman sliding from his back. He wore the suit well now, though it still felt, some days, like borrowed clothing over the same boy who used to sleep on benches 2 miles from here. His shoulders had filled out. His face had lost the hollow, hunted look of a child, carrying more than any child should have to carry alone. But his eyes, when he looked up at the hospital's glass entrance, held the exact same steadiness they'd held that day. The look of someone who does not walk away from people who need him, no matter the cost. Devante Achebe reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, cracked leather Bible. It had traveled with him through every version of the year that followed, through his final year of high school, completed not on a park bench, but in a proper bedroom with a proper desk, in the house Graham had helped him and Ellie settle into together. Through the quiet, patient work of legal proceedings that formally recognized him as Graham's nephew and heir to his mother's rightful share of a family estate he still sometimes struggled to believe was real. Through long Sunday dinners at Mount Zion's Fellowship Hall, where Pastor Odom now introduced him, beaming, as our boy who carried the whole neighborhood on his back and didn't even know it. He opened the Bible now, on the sidewalk, to the same worn page it always fell open to, Psalm 27, his mother's favorite, the one she used to recite to him on nights when their apartment felt too quiet and too uncertain, and the future felt like something that only happened to other people. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? He read it silently, the way he did every year on this date, then closed the Bible gently and tucked it back into his pocket, exactly where it had always belonged. The year hadn't been easy, even with everything that changed. Devante had learned that quickly, that having a family, a home, and money and trust didn't erase 8 months of sleeping on benches, didn't undo grief, didn't make the nightmares about hospital hallways stop right away. Some nights he still woke up gasping, certain for a few disoriented seconds that Ellie's weight was slipping from his back, that he was about to drop her, that he'd failed the one promise that mattered. Graham had gotten him a therapist, gently, without making it feel like a demand. A soft-spoken man named Dr. Kwame Boateng, who understood in ways few others could what it meant to carry grief and displacement at the same time. Devante resisted at first, the way he resisted most things offered too easily. But he kept going back, week after week, and slowly the nightmares thinned out, though they never fully disappeared. He finished his final year of high school at a private academy Graham enrolled him in, nervous the first week that he wouldn't belong among students who'd never known a single hungry night in their lives. He surprised himself by thriving. His mother's insistence on excellence, drilled into him since he could read, hadn't left him even during the worst months. He graduated with honors that spring. In a cap and gown, Ellie insisted on ironing herself, despite everyone telling her to let the dry cleaner handle it. He spent long weekends that year learning about a country he'd never seen, Nigeria, the home his father had left, the home his mother had walked away from twice over, once by leaving Lagos and once by cutting ties with Graham's family entirely. Graham took him there for 2 weeks in the spring to Lagos, where distant cousins Devante never knew existed, wept and embraced him and told him stories about his father, Emeka, that his mother had never lived long enough to share herself. He came home from that trip carrying something new alongside his grief. A fuller sense of who he was, stitched together finally from both halves of a family that had spent 31 years apart. And through all of it, twice a week, without fail, he kept visiting Ellie. Some habits, he'd decided, were worth keeping even after the reason for them had changed. There had been one afternoon in the dead of winter when the weight of everything finally caught up to him all at once. He'd come to visit Ellie at the small cottage and found her asleep in her chair by the window, a half-finished crossword resting on her lap. And something about the stillness of the scene, so different from the frantic hallway where they'd nearly lost each other, undid him completely. He sat down on the floor beside her chair and wept, quietly, for his mother, for the 8 months he'd spent invisible on Chicago's streets. For every night he'd told himself no one was coming to help him and had been right. Ellie woke partway through and, without a word, reached down and rested her hand on the crown of his head, the way she imagined a grandmother might, the way no one had done for him since his mother passed. "You don't have to carry all of it alone anymore, baby," she'd said, her voice still thick with sleep. "That's the whole point of what we built here. You put some of it down. Let somebody else hold a piece of it for a while." He hadn't fully believed her that afternoon, but he'd returned to it, again and again, in the months that followed, each time finding it a little more true than the last. Today wasn't just an anniversary. Today was a ribbon cutting. Directly beside the hospital's main entrance, where an unremarkable stretch of concrete had sat empty for a year, now stood a small building with warm brick and wide windows. The Adaize Achebe Family Respite Center, funded jointly by Graham's hospital network and, in no small part, by Devante himself, who had insisted every dollar be tied to his mother's name rather than his own. It wasn't a hospital wing for wealthy donors. It was something Devante had designed specifically, sitting for months with architects and social workers, and most importantly, with people who understood exactly what he and Ellie had lived through. A place where families without transportation, without insurance cards, without the right paperwork on hand, could bring a sick loved one and receive immediate care and dignity while longer-term arrangements were sorted out. A place where no receptionist would ever again ask a frightened teenager to prove his right to love someone before that someone was allowed to see a doctor. A crowd had gathered for the opening. Hospital staff, city officials who'd been quietly shamed into showing up by the previous year's headlines, Mount Zion's entire congregation occupying nearly a third of the folding chairs set up on the lawn, and in the front row, in a wheelchair decorated with a small bouquet of daisies someone had tied to its handles, Eleanor Whitaker, 82 years old now, stronger than she'd been in years, her hair still white as snow, her eyes bright and clear as she watched the boy she'd helped raise stand at a podium in front of a building bearing his mother's name. Beside her sat Nathan Whitaker, Jr., his hand resting gently on his mother's shoulder. A small gesture that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone who hadn't watched the distance between them slowly, carefully, imperfectly close over the past year. He still had a long way to go. Everyone in that family knew it, including Nathan himself. But he was there. Every week now, he was there. Graham stood near the back of the crowd, arms crossed, watching his nephew with the quiet pride of a man who had spent 31 years searching for a piece of his family he thought was lost forever, only to find it standing on a sidewalk in a stained hoodie, carrying someone else's mother, because no one had ever taught him that some kinds of love come with conditions. Pastor Odom sat in the second row, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief his wife had pressed into his hand before they'd even left the house that morning, certain he'd need it. Patrice Dubois was there too, her mother Yvonne beside her in a new wheelchair. Resettled now in a small, well-run facility Graham's foundation had helped fund in the wake of Lakeshore Manor's closure. Otis Freeman, steadier now on the correct medication, had come with his daughter, who'd flown in from Atlanta specifically for the occasion. Even Denise Hollingsworth's name had come up once more in the months since the hearing. Not at the ceremony, but in a quiet conversation Devante had with Graham the week prior. Her restitution payments, small and steady, had begun arriving to the residents she'd wronged, court-mandated and closely monitored. Devante hadn't asked for forgiveness on her behalf the way he had for Nathan. Some doors, he'd come to understand, needed to stay shut a while longer, maybe forever. Grace wasn't the same thing as forgetting, and it definitely wasn't the same thing as pretending harm hadn't happened. It was choosing, carefully, which doors were worth reopening and which ones simply needed to close so healing could begin on the other side. Devante stepped up to the small podium set up on the lawn. He hadn't prepared a speech, not really. Graham had offered to have something written for him by a professional, and Devante had politely declined, the way he'd learned to politely decline most things that didn't feel like his own voice. "A year ago," he began, "right here on this sidewalk, I carried a woman I love more than almost anybody in this world, and I got told to put her down. Told I needed to prove who she was to me before anybody would help her breathe." He paused, looking out over the crowd. Familiar faces from Mount Zion, strangers who'd traveled from across the city after following the story online, hospital staff who'd since undergone new training that Devante himself had helped design. "I used to think family was about blood, about who you were born to and who was born to you. My daddy died before I ever met him. My mama died when I needed her most. And for a long while after that, I thought I didn't have anybody left who counted as real family." He glanced back at Ellie, whose eyes had already filled with tears. Then a woman who wasn't my blood at all held on to me in a hallway when nobody else would and told me not to disappear on her. And an uncle I never knew existed recognized a Bible on a hospital floor and refused to let a room full of strangers decide I wasn't worth helping. He took a breath, steadying himself. I don't think family is about blood anymore. I think it's about who shows up, who carries who when carrying is hard. This building's got my mama's name on it because she taught me that lesson before I even understood I was learning it. She showed up for me every single day of her life, even when she was running out of days to do it in. I just want to make sure nobody else in this city has to carry somebody they love alone, the way I almost did. He looked directly into the small cluster of cameras set up near the front of the crowd. Local news, this time invited rather than ambushing, and let his voice settle into something quieter, more personal. So here's what I'd ask you, if you're watching this. Think of somebody in your life right now who's carrying more than they should have to carry alone. A parent, a neighbor, somebody at your church who stopped coming around because things got hard and nobody checked on them. And ask yourself, when's the last time you actually showed up? Not called, not thought about it, showed up. He let the question sit in the summer air for a moment, the way his mother used to let silence do work that words couldn't. I want to tell you about the people who did show up, he continued, because it wasn't just me carrying somebody that day. It was a whole lot of people carrying me, in ways I didn't even realize at the time. He looked toward Mount Zion's section of the crowd. A church that organized a drive for a boy they hadn't seen in months, because somebody remembered whose son I was. A pastor who preached a sermon about failing me out loud in front of his whole congregation because he cared more about telling the truth than protecting anybody's pride, including his own. He glanced toward Patrice and Yvonne, toward Otis and his daughter. Families who found the courage to stand up in a hearing room and say out loud what happened to the people they loved, even when it was easier to stay quiet. An uncle who searched for 31 years for a sister he thought he'd never find, and who, when he finally did find a piece of her, chose to build something with it instead of just grieving what he'd lost. He looked last of all at Ellie, and a woman who held on to a homeless boy in a hallway when he had absolutely nothing to offer her back, who told him not to disappear and meant it, and then spent the next year proving she meant it every single day. His voice softened further, the podium suddenly feeling smaller beneath his hands. My mama used to tell me that the Lord puts people in your path for a reason, even when you don't understand the reason yet. I didn't understand it that day on this sidewalk. I just knew I couldn't put her down. Whoever you're carrying right now, don't put them down either, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. He stepped back from the podium as the crowd rose to their feet, applause rolling warm across the summer lawn, and made his way straight to Ellie's wheelchair, kneeling down in front of her the way he had 100 times before on 100 less hopeful afternoons. You did good, baby, Ellie said, cupping his face in both her hands, her voice thick with tears. Your mama would be so proud of you. I know I am. I couldn't have done any of it without you, Devante said. You were the one who told me not to disappear. And you were the one who never did, Ellie said. Not once. Not for one single day. Nathan stepped forward then, hesitating only a moment before extending his hand to Devante. Not the stiff, formal handshake of their earliest, most guarded conversations, but something looser, warmer, closer to what it might have looked like if circumstances had made them family from the start, rather than forcing them into it through crisis. Thank you, Nathan said quietly, for asking that room to leave a door open for me. I don't know that I would have had the strength to walk back through it if you hadn't. Thank her, Devante said, nodding toward Ellie. She's the one who kept believing you might. The three of them stood together for a moment on the lawn, an unlikely family assembled from grief and negligence and, somehow, grace, a homeless teenager, a billionaire's long-lost nephew, an elderly woman nearly erased by the very system built to protect her, and the son who'd finally found his way back to her. Behind them, the doors of the Adaize Achebe Family Respite Center stood open for the first time, warm light spilling out onto the same sidewalk where, exactly 1 year earlier, a boy with nothing left in the world had refused to let go of someone the world had already decided didn't matter. A young volunteer wheeled Ellie's chair gently toward the entrance so she could be among the first to see the building bearing the name of the woman who'd loved her like a friend and raised, without ever meaning to, the boy who would go on to save them both. Devante walked beside her, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair the whole way. Not carrying her this time, simply walking beside her, the way people do when the weight has finally gently been set down and shared. The Bible stayed in his pocket, Some things he'd learned. You don't need to hold in your hands to know they're still with you. A word before we go. Every single one of us knows somebody who's carrying more than they should have to carry alone. A parent whose calls have gotten shorter and less frequent. A neighbor who used to come to church every Sunday and just stopped. Somebody who needs a ride, a meal, a phone call, a hand to hold in a hallway when the world feels too big and too indifferent to notice them. Devontae didn't have money. He didn't have power. He didn't have anywhere to sleep most nights. What he had was a decision he made, over and over again, to show up for somebody the world had already stopped seeing. That decision is the only inheritance any of us truly gets to choose for ourselves. So I'll ask you the same question Devontae asked that crowd on the lawn. Who are you carrying right now? And is there somebody right now, today, who's waited too long for you to check in? If this story moved you the way it moved me writing it, tell somebody about it. Share it with the person in your life who needs to hear that showing up still matters, that family is built as much by choice as by blood, and that sometimes the smallest, most exhausted act of love, carrying somebody 6 blocks when nobody else will, is the very thing that changes everything. Don't put them down. Not today. Not ever, if you can help it. The end.